The continent of Africa means several things to several people. To some, it is the continent that gave birth to humanity. Yet to some, and quite strangely, it is just a small country with its capital somewhere in Johannesburg. Welcome to Global Perspectives today as we talk about what Africa means to you. And with me in the studio to do the discussion, it's Kevin Hayes, a third-year PhD student in the School of Communications, Ohio University. Prosper Chikata, PhD candidate, School of Communications, and Te Tolowani, a first-year graduate student in International Development Studies, also here in Ohio University. Welcome to Global Perspectives.
Thank you.
Yeah, Te, I'm going to be starting with you. If somebody should ask you what Africa means to you, what would be your response?
Well, to me, I'm an African, but Africa means much more than just a continent. Africa is the way has influenced my, behavior, my accent, the way I think, sometimes the way I dress. It has influenced the way I even approach my academics here, even in the US, in so many ways. So when you mention Africa, it's all of these things in one. It's just so many complexities laid out for me.
Okay. Prosper, you just had Tay talk about what Africa means to her. Could you also let us in on what Africa means to you?
Well, I think your question is so pregnant with too many other questions.
Sure.
It does not only mean what it means to me, it also means what it means to others, diasporan Africans, non-Africans, and we, those from the continent, as we constantly attempt to frame and represent ourselves, and how those from outside the continent also make efforts to frame and represent us. Mm-hmm. Now, talking about framing and representation of us, then you're talking about the history of the continent, its politics, its economy, and what have you. And I think that all those things are intertwined in making us who we are. So if I should speak from my personal perspective, if you like, I would say Africa is a home, and there is no place like Africa.
Oh, that's wonderful. There's definitely no place like home Africa.
Right.
You made a very important point, which is that Africa, what Africa means could be seen from various perspectives to people in the diaspora, and including African Americans, Europeans, and all that. So we have an African American, somebody I call a brother, Kevin. Kevin is an African American, like I said earlier, but we all know the passion and the love that he also has for the continent. So we also thought it wise to include him in this program. Kelvin, share with us what Africa means to you.
Oh, wow. Well, the sister and the brother certainly hit many great points, many great aspects. And as an African that was brought to America, certainly spending substantial time in West and Southern Africa, Africa to me is home, and it really is home on many levels. And I do hope one day to be able to relocate permanently to the continent somewhere in beautiful West Africa. It's home. It is the birthplace of the human family, where we all are Africans of one sort or another, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. And so on so many levels, it's really the epicenter of human civilization, the human family. And that's what it is to me. The motherland, it's home.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to ask you, I'm not sort of thinking that you're going to be speaking for the whole of the African American community, but I just want to find out from you that is there the general feeling that, there's a strong connection to the continent, or it's otherwise?
Well, I'm a professional Africologist. I've spent 15 years researching Black life and culture all over the world, Canada, Mexico, Latin America, Africa, Europe, and certainly nearly every state in the American Union. And I would, without any problem, and certainly for those who have had the honor to go to see Africa, right, those in diaspora, I would think many of us certainly feel the same way. There's always been that connection, despite the fact that there have been many attempts, of course, to disconnect us from each other, right? There's been attempts, slavery and Jim Crow, and now the neo-colonial era, but you can't, I don't care how long a child has been away from home, essentially an Igbo proverb, right?
Yeah.
And sooner or later, he or she will find their way back, because it is home.
Yeah. Oh, that's a beautiful point right there. Tay, you said something that I thought was very important when you talked about how Africa has contributed to molding who you are. But usually this issue comes up as in if there's a centrality or if there's a central theme when you're talking about, or if there's anything that you could refer to as African culture. It's a continent of diverse cultures and all that. But I'm going to ask you, what do you think has been the impact, of if there is anything as culture relating to the continent or where you're from as in Nigeria? What has been that impact on your life in general?
On my life in general,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, like looking at me right now, you can see like an African sitting right in front of you. As for the centrality of Africa, people tend to think that because we are all Africans, we all have the same ways of life, but we really don't. I moved from Nigeria to Ghana, and I could see that difference. Like, I meet a Nigerian, I can tell this is a Nigerian. I meet a Southern African, I can tell that they are from Southern Africa, but I cannot tell what part. But when they get to meet another Southern African, they will be able to tell the difference. So when actually I kind of have an aversion to saying I'm from Africa, I always say I am African, but I am not from Africa. I am from Nigeria, but I am African, because once you start saying you're from Africa, then you begin to undermine the fact that there are different, countries within the continent, and that's when people tend to make the mistake by saying, the country of Africa. I am African, but I am from Nigeria.
Exactly.
That's what
Exactly. And Prosper, I know this issue also means a lot to you. Several times people confuse it to, people actually say, there's a school of thought that says that there's a particular culture that could be identified as African, and then we also have, the view that there is no central theme or central culture that relates to everybody coming from the continent, because we are different people. Tell us your take on that.
Right, I'll take it from where Kevin stopped and continue with what she said. In fact, we must look at some of the historical representations of the continent, what I call one size fit all. Now, it is a product of the imperial imposition of the demarcations across the globe. Now, when that happened, the result was that, in fact, black people all over the world, including, black people in America, Jim Crow and its suppression made them to identify with other suppressed people around the globe. So before decolonization, you could see that strong unity between the diaspora and the continent of Africa. Now that sort of unity, that sort of oneness to confront, one enemy, we can't say exactly that today. We can see some delinking between the African and the African American, and these are all products of history. Because, in fact, if you look at the continent today, most of the countries of the continent have gained their independence. And so the struggle is more internal today. So the American struggle today is totally, somehow different from what the struggle is on the continent. Now, talking about representation again, in terms of what my sister just said, Africa has 55 countries. But in fact, the self-indulgence of, outsiders who have been in the image factory producing our images and identities are such that, in fact, it is easier to stereotype people and present them in a particular way that makes meaning to, the powers that be. And so we've been lumped together as Africans, no matter where you are, no matter what you do differently or whatever. So the impact of that has been that if you have one notorious leader on the continent, Africa, misbehaving somewhere, he or she becomes the representation of the rest. And so we come under that sort of image. That
is actually a point I would want you to hold on, because that forms the crux of today's discussion too, when we go to the political side. But Kevin, I think that, being an African American, this question, you could also tackle this question from, if I could say, from with an independent mind, because you are not, directly or exactly coming from the continent as both of them are. So do you see that there's a central thing in your experience? You know, you're an Africologist, and do you see that there's a central thing called the African culture?
Well, I'm going to fall back to the scholarship of two great thinkers, Du Bois, who said about 80 years ago that the destiny of black folks in Africa is directly tied to black folks everywhere.
Sure.
And as long as Africa was denigrated, right, misunderstood, you could be African anywhere in the world,
Sure.
and you will be similarly denigrated and
Sure.
misunderstood.
Sure.
And of course, my main man, Sheikh Anta Diop, the great Senegalese scholar,
Yeah.
theorist, you know, his great book, The Cultural Unity of Africa. So of course now, 2,000 different cultures and peoples, it's hard to lump that together, right? A little over 2,000 to be precise. But Diop is right, and I think that there are certainly many commonalities that people share on the continent. The notion that life is centered around family and clan, that inclusion is important, not exclusion, the understanding of things is like time, right? So I think there are certainly some important aspects of so-called culture, right? What we see as what we call culture in this world, and something that is genuinely, uniquely, and beautifully African.
Yeah, okay. Prosper, you realize that when you talked about the I would say the period after decolonization,
Right.
you realize that the struggle has been a different issue.
Right.
You know, because just as you said before, in the days of colonialism, you know, people could join forces to fight a common force.
Exactly.
You know, a common cause.
Exactly.
But now, after independence, and everybody, each one for him or herself, and you know, so it's like everywhere now. But I'm going to ask you that, what do you think was some of the ills? Obviously, you know, some of these things go without saying, but what do you think were some of the ills that came on the continent with the advent of colonialism?
Well, in fact, one problem that is still, you know, relevant to our political and economic discourse on the continent today is the way countries on the continent have been demarcated and put together. If you look at those of us, Ewers, divided between Ghana, Togo, and Benin, you know what happens in Ghana when elections or something goes wrong, you know?
Yeah.
Reference is made to the newcomers,
Sure.
the number 9. They are, you know, normally the problem. And we have seen this between Eritrea and Ethiopia. We still see that in Sudan, where, you know, those of Arab origin feel that the black people in Sudan do not belong. And we saw what came out of that, leading to demarcation of Sudan, South Sudan, and main Sudan.
Quite
In fact, that
recently.
hasn't solved the problem. The problem is still there.
Yeah.
So you can see these things dotted around the continent. So writers like the Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka poses the question, is there the need for us to re-examine those borders? But anytime these questions come up, then you are being anti-nation. You are calling for disintegration of the nation. And that is, you know, a difficult question to pose.
Yeah.
Not until, you know, countries have, or people have, societies have some internal logic that, you know, sort of connect people, right?
Yeah.
And so we can just go on like that without going back to the roots of some of the things that connect some unique people, right?
I don't mean to cut you, but I'm so much in love with this point that you're making. You know, ever since you recommended Soyinka's latest work to me,
Right.
you know, I realized that these borders, definitely, I mean, and I just got to make it bad. I mean, I think they form the crux of the problems that most of the countries, you know, in Africa we're facing. When you
Right.
talk about, you know, inter-country wars and conflicts and stuff like that. Yeah. But Tay, I'm going to give you the same question. You're also coming from the continent.
Right.
Do you see some of the problems that I would say Nigeria, and in your view or your experience, some countries in Africa, some of the countries they're facing now, being traced, you know, back to the history of colonialism?
Yeah, definitely. Like he said, so when the colonial masters came, they made the the minority.
And just to make a correction, there was a joke between my friends and I that there's no more time to be calling colonial masters because that was just by the way. Though,
Okay, so when they came, they made minorities leaders over the majority group within, you know, the country or you know, within the region. Yeah. And so in Nigeria, what you see is the Hausas were made rulers over, you know, pretty much everybody. And even within the system of governance today, you see over time, it has been the Hausa people that have been, you know, taking up the presidential seat. And they have the sense of entitlement to that seat at the moment. And also you see conflicts, you know, taking place like Hausa people and other, you know, tribes within the country. And there have been discussions on the Hausas separating from the old country. But at the end of the day, the same question exists. Should we separate? Should we form new borders? Is it too late to start talking about that? Or should we just take it as it is and move past, you know, the historical?
Maybe,
Let me add to what she just said. If you consider even the attempt to bring together all these countries in terms of political and economic integration at the sub-regional level, Economic Community of West Africa, what, you know, became apparent is that, in fact, you have French-speaking countries that still owe, you know, allegiance to France. And so how do you integrate these economies? And you also find that, I mean, there are internal problems too. Countries are at different levels of development. If you're looking at, let's say, Ghana with, you know, its economy about $40 billion worth, and you're looking at Niger with about $6 billion worth of its economy. And per capita income is higher in Ghana than in Niger. If you put these countries together, what is going to happen? You are creating a situation where places where there are higher levels of unemployment, labor is going to move. Mobility of labor. Labor is always in search of, you know, better conditions of service and so on. So in spite of the colonial baggage, we also do have our own internal problems.
Can I just add that this baggage is also, there's more to it than politics. There's also the mentality, the oppression, I mean, oppressed? Mentality of the oppressed. That every African, or most Africans, carry with them every time feeling like you're being oppressed and the system is oppressive, and, you know, this draws you back. You don't want to move past that. Yeah,
that's a huge baggage as well. But Kevin, Tay asked the question, you know, and I think she bounced off from what Prosper just said. Do we just leave, you know, these modalities as they are, you know, as they were first set by those who came to colonize the continent, or it's about time that you think the continent took a second look and really looked into the some of the oppressions of some of these things that were left on the continent? Is it about time?
There are two things that sort of come to mind immediately, Kingsley. Two things. When you think about it now, it really hasn't been all that long that there's been a Nigeria or a Ghana or Gold Coast colony, right? Or Sierra Leone or Liberia, right? So winter of 1884, Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor, invites all of the other colonial powers, right, to Germany, and they sit down and divide up Africa. So the map that we see today of Africa, fiction that it is created in that fall, that winter of 1884, into the spring of 1885. Each colonial power, you know, carves out what he or she wants, right? So think about now, 1884, 1885, 2013. So before the 1880s, the whole notion of a European version of a state, a nation state, right, is really un-African. It wasn't something Africans implemented or organized themselves around. So for the vast majority of the time, humans have lived in Africa, modern humans, right, 200,000 years, there's been no notion of a so-called nation state. So you have all of that weighed against, right, a century and a half.
But the idea was there, you know, the idea of people always living together, you know, within a
city-states and clans, right? Some Africans had kingdoms, like your Akans, the Igbo, who I love. There was no such thing as an Igbo kingdom, right? The Igbo preferred decentralized city-states. So it's not impossible to get back to that, Kingsley. It's going to take a lot of effort and conversation, of course, now, right? I'm not a Mary Poppins type.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's impossible to get back to it.
Yeah.
Humans can do whatever humans envision they can do.
I see Prosper shaking his head. Is there a reaction to that?
Yeah, in fact, talking about the possibility of that or the impossibility of that is like thinking of leapfrogging backwards into the past, which I do not see as a possibility. If you look at the structures that we have put in place today, look at education, look at the health sector. I'm just writing something on the biomedical model of health and then the African traditional model of health. Look at our medical schools. What do they teach, the students that go through them? Purely biomedical, health models, not African traditional medicine. Look at our educational system. I read more about Anthony Giddens and theories of Foucault than I read of Wole Soyinka. I came to the United States, had to do African studies as part of my international development program. And that was how I got exposed to Frantz Fanon and co, right? If you talk about Frantz Fanon today on the continent, who knows who the hell that man is? Do you get what I'm saying? So the very things that we complain have been used to enslave us, we now incorporate those things for our own purposes. It could be for a good reason. Rwanda woke up one day and they said, okay, we are changing from French to English. What does that mean? It means they look at, the global trend of things. Are we at a better position using English to participate in the global, wealth that is created, or we should stay in our small corner? So somehow we need to look at some of the practical issues that are involved in, some of these things that confront us as a people,
But I have to see that whole either-or dynamic. I've never liked it and still don't. So many societies in Asia have been able to find a way in between. I'm not saying go back to a cave in the Stone Age. One can take what is good from the Western ways, but you make it African. You make it for you and about you and to serve you.
Exactly.
So I have no issue with that.
Yeah, I think from the various discussions so far, what I've been able to gather is that obviously this colonialism thing we're talking about came with the baggage, and just as Kevin said, Africa as a continent, existed way before the advent of colonialism and the way we used to live and everything. Nobody's going to say that it was primitive as it came to be seen. But it was a way we lived, and it's actually, if you look at it, it's the central.
It was said to be primitive.
That's what I'm saying. It was said to be primitive, but it wasn't primitive.
It wasn't.
It wasn't
the
primitive.
Reality.
It was said to be. That's what you said earlier when you said the people who have been made to tell the story or who have been made to paint the picture have painted a particular image. Right. But shooting right across from that, of that, to the era of. Let's say to the current era, after most countries have gained independence, there are political parties all over, this democratic system of governance is in place. Has it been the better? Has it been the best for Africa?
I honestly think that is where the problem is. Kevin talked about the connection between Africa and diaspora. And I honestly think over the years, based on my experience, that if the continent has made some significant progress in terms of, human material needs and so on, it would have served as a mecca for the African American in the diaspora. You pick your passport and you go back to, the motherland. But once the motherland is still not, a very stable place, whatever the motherland suffers will be suffered by those in the diaspora. No question about that.
For children.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
And we see the manifestation of that day in, day out.
Yeah.
We all watch what happened to Trayvon Martin and all the hullabaloo around that, it saddens, most of us, but that is the story, that's the narrative.
Yeah, but I was actually talking about the role of the post-colonial African leader
Right.
You know, these leaders who took over after we were happy, after we gained independence, after the era of decolonization, you know, what have been the various roles they've played? Is it really propelling the continent to the level that we so much desire?
Can I just say
sure, you can.
That these leaders that took over after the colonial powers left, they were following a model. And, you know, they didn't just they followed the model that was laid out and left behind.
And what kind of model was that?
So there was a power that was ruling people.
Yeah.
And this was what they saw. People came, they extorted resources. This is what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're following that model. So it's really, Africa really doesn't have any exemplary model that we don't know what works for us. And that's the problem, because we've not really had the opportunity to, you know, explore, to see what exactly would work for, you know, would be conducive for the continent or for each individual country within a continent.
Yeah, Prosper.
Well, I think talking about a model, that's
with reference to the post-colonial leaders?
Yeah, let's take Kwame Nkrumah, for instance.
Sure.
Kwame Nkrumah was a struggling man just like you and I when he was a student in the United States. Yeah. So he came from the grassroots, so he understood what suffering means, you know. So when he returned to Ghana, he was not only for Ghana. What did he say? He said that the independence of Ghana was meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent.
Right.
Because he saw where the world was heading, that in fact you can confront the world with, you know, just a small country. Look at China. China is now playing, you know, its population advantage. The United States has used economics of scale for so many years. There are over 300 million, right? So if you even program a program in New York and it airs on CNN, you know how many people catch that? But we are so fragmented. So in fact, the idea to reverse, you know, what was planted by the colonialists was there, but how was it implemented? I think that was where the problem was.
Do you see any difference between the first generation of the post-colonial African leaders, the Kwame Nkrumahs, the Jomo Kenyattas, you know, the Nyereres, you know, and later the Mandelas, and the present-day crop of leaders that we have?
The current crop of leaders we have on the continent, if those were the people who should earn independence for us, that wouldn't have happened.
That's true.
Kevin, how true is that?
I think it's very true. It's unfortunate, but it's correct.
Yeah.
And it's sad to say that. That first wave, those men were geniuses, in my opinion, and they were freedom fighters, and they had such good ideas and such good energy. I'm not saying they were perfect. Nkrumah was not perfect, but neither was George Washington, a slave owner now, okay? Neither was Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves, okay? So no leader is perfect now. So, but the good
they were more tilted towards the side of perfection than what we have these days.
What would we do if we had an Nkrumah today? What would we do? We would go crazy.
Yeah. What's the missing link? What happened?
I guess I was going to say that if you take the first wave leaders and put them in this present age, would they still do the same thing they did then? That we should think about that. I guess the question is, what exactly has changed?
What do you think has changed?
I think we just became, okay, so we got this privilege from the first wave leaders and we became lackadaisical. We didn't know how to further. The first wave leaders, they were in the oppression, so they had that passion, you know, and they paved the way. And then the way was paved and we just sat back and like, okay, we're going to enjoy it, and it's fading away.
Prosper, what do you think is the way forward?
Well, I hear all kinds of theories and concepts, you know, here and there. Some say, in fact, Africa has to evolve its own kind of democracy. But we in Ghana and some other parts of the continent, we can see, if we even look at the traditional arbitration system, where the chieftaincy institution is still intact, right, to some extent, you know, it's still there. So people still can resort to arbitration through the chief's palace and so on. And we look at, you know, the European import in terms of the judicial system. You can compare and contrast that yourself and see which one is working, what has gone wrong, and so on. That is not for me to say. Now, talking about returning, you know, carving Africa's own democracy, Do I want my country to return to something like, let's say, Swaziland? No. Democracy, what is it? We all understand that the dynamics within each society plays into the democratic process. So for instance, in South Africa, you have the ANC, right? Even though it's a democratic country now, we understand that the ANC is going to be in power for a long time, and it lacks opposition. And that you can see the translation of that into the politics of South Africa. You see the same thing in Botswana. In Ghana, we have a strong opposition, right? What that is doing to us is we are able to expose each other through the democratic process. So we have MPP, NDC, they're almost 50-50 at the polls, right? Yeah. So I would say that, yes, we are on the right trajectory. I don't want a situation where there will be a reversal to something like Swaziland or whatever.
Prosper definitely doesn't want the whole continent to take after the Swaziland model. Right. For all you know, it's also working in Swaziland. Thank you so much for featuring today on Global Perspectives. And we looked at what Africa means to you, and we've heard what Africa means to the various panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.